The Visitor, written by Paul F. Olson, read by Scott McDonald. There is no more beautiful season than fall in Upper Michigan, although that is strictly opinion. Certain folks love spring above the rest, and certain more love summer. There are even those few, snowmobilers, skiers, and the most avid of the tourist haters, who champion winter. But to my mind, there is nothing greater than autumn and its crystalline mornings, its steady afternoon rains, its haunting winds that are never quite still, even in the quietest hours. Despite that, there is something about the season that is not quite right. Something that hasn't been quite right, in fact, since Kent Barkley began coming into town each October 1st, taking a room at Elvira Martin's boarding house and leaving again during the first week of November. Kent Barkley. Precisely who he is, I don't know. Or maybe I do. Maybe I do, and am just afraid to speak it. He certainly seems harmless enough on the surface, a gentle wisp of a man. He merely strolls the narrow main street and even narrower side streets, nodding to people, kicking at pebbles, and searching the sky as if for treasure. On days that it rains, you can see him at his window in the boarding house, and always the same room, always room number 3, up front, second floor, looking out passively. He smiles pleasantly, always treats our dogs and children well. He's even capable, on those occasions he's approached in the park, of holding a rather stimulating conversation. Perhaps what troubles me about the little fellow is only the blunt and prosaic fact that here is a man who comes into a tiny burg like Patterson Falls once a year, stays a month or thereabouts, and leaves, for no apparent reason that anyone has ever been able to tell. He's never fully answered questions on that score, that much is certain. He's apt to just smile sadly and say in that fine, thin voice of his, "Vacation," or just sightseeing. But more likely, my fear is deeper, more complicated. In fact, I know it is. It's fear of the way accidents seem to follow Kent Barkley while he's in the falls. Fear of the way those accidents grow slightly worse each year. The first year, 9 years ago, he tripped and fell over an admittedly wide and dangerous sidewalk crack along Appleton Street. He happened to fall in the path of little Billy Hardesty and his Schwinn. Billy swerved and plowed the Schwinn into a rather large oak. Both were relatively unhurt, although Billy had a nicely abraded elbow to show off at the grammar school in Ishpeming the next day. It went on like that for several years, 1 or 2 incidents each October, no one really hurt or put out, no one really troubled. But then, was it 4 years ago? No, I believe it was 5. Barkley, on his afternoon rounds, was going into the IGA when the wind suddenly snatched the door from his hand and slammed it outward. That in itself would not have been so bad, but it just so happened that Joey Wenderson was following immediately behind. Automatically, he thrust out an arthritic hand to keep from being hit, but his hand went straight through the glass, shattering it, leaving jagged shards hanging. According to Barb Foley, who was running the register that day, Joey let out a squawk like only a startled and wounded old man could, and foolishly jerked his hand back, gashing his arm in 5 places, 3 deep enough to take stitches. After that, those of us who gathered around the card table every Saturday at Kendrick's True Value Hardware, and I must say on my own behalf that as a retired teacher from the Marquette school system, and probably the most educated person in the Falls, I still fit into those gatherings rather well, took to calling little Kent Barkley the jinx and the curse, jokingly speculating over coffee about what sort of trouble he was going to cause next. We didn't have long to wait. 2 weeks later, just before he left town for the year, he strolled absently across the intersection of Parsons and Appleton, directly in front of a Chevy driven by an out-of-towner salesman who had just been pitching his wares to the manager of the Knife and Fork Diner. The salesman hit the brakes a touch too hard and cracked the steering wheel, to say nothing of his skull. I believe he took 19 stitches, but I don't recall the precise number. The next year was the same. 2 people hurt to bleeding by our visitor's bumbling or clumsiness or ignorance or whatever it was. The year after that, 3 people. The year after that, 2 again. One of those was our mayor, who nearly severed 2 fingers on his left hand trying to catch an axe that Barclay knocked off its display rack in the hardware store. Our Saturday accusations against Barclay grew stronger, and Paul Kendricks, who had driven the mayor to the hospital in Marquette, even suggested, only half humorously, that perhaps there was some ordinance to keep such a dangerous soul out of town. "What's he come here for, anyhow?" Joey Wenderson said, touching his scarred arm ruefully. "What's a fellow like that want here every year?" We only looked at each other and shrugged. It was a question all of us had asked for the past 5 or 6 years, and one to which none of us had an answer. But as always happened, by December we had more or less forgotten about Barclay and taken up the threads of our more mundane existence. His name came up only occasionally in the winter and spring and summer, and even those hurt by his blundering seemed to harbor no ill will against him during those months. His presence in Patterson Falls each October was still a mystery, but so, in their own ways, were the coming of the birds each spring, the freezing of Conley Lake each winter, the turning of the autumn leaves. You see, we had already, in one form or another, come to accept him as an ordained and inexorable part of our simple lives. It wasn't until that last year, months ago now, that all that began to change. Barclay came into town just before noon on October 1st, wheeling his little blue Pinto up to Elvira Martin's and carrying his single faded tartan suitcase inside. It was cold for that early, and raining steadily. An hour after his arrival, we saw him from the hardware store, sitting in the window of room number 3, gazing out at the somnolent main street with the blandness that had become his trademark. "Little guy's back," George Loveworth noted, tapping ash from the dregs of his coffee. "Looks that way," I said. There was a pause, and then Paul Kendricks asked the time-honored question, "What do you suppose he wants here anyway?" We gave him the time-honored response, blank, silent expressions. "He ain't got no family around," Kendricks said, persisting. "Not even what you'd call friends. All he does is walk around in circles and set up in that window there. I don't know. I just don't get it." That was the extent of our Kent-Barclay discussions that first day. There was no mention of the accidents, although I suppose all of us were wondering just when the first one would happen, just what it would be. For a while it appeared that we were going to be disappointed that year. There was usually one incident during Barclay's first week in the Falls, 1 or 2 more during his last. This time, however, the first 3 weeks of his visit passed uneventfully. Perhaps, using hindsight, I could attribute that to the fact that it rained almost continuously during those weeks. Barclay was rarely seen outside. Still, he was at his window every day, like a silent but certainly sentient guardian, or a prisoner staring out longingly at the streets of freedom. Then one day the rain stopped. The next morning the sodden pavement gleamed in the early sunlight. Barclay was up, according to our chief of police, Harv Benedict, by 7 o'clock, strolling down Main, turning almost absently at Bridgeton, and swinging past the old abandoned school. Benedict told us later, but not in his official capacity, that he had been out on morning rounds when he passed Barclay, that he nodded and said hello, received a similar greeting back, all perfectly ordinary. It was what followed later that morning that was not ordinary at all, that shattered routine and changed our muddled thinking about Barclay for good. It happened around 11:30, and on this, I don't need to rely on second-hand accounts. I was there. I saw it. I saw it all. I was out on morning rounds of my own, enjoying the crispness and the just-washed freshness of the day, breathing in great lungs full of air, watching drenched, dull brown leaves drop limply to the earth. I had stopped by the post office to say hello to Vinnie Pierce, then by the IGA to greet Barb Foley and buy a roll of certs. My next stop was John Barlow's State Farm office. I was inside with John, chewing over the local high school football scene and the high cost of getting by, when Barclay ambled past the big-picture window out front. "There he goes," John said. It was a simple statement, and I saw no need of reply. John went on. "Strange little guy, don't you think? Nice enough, though." I nodded and savored a certs. At least he's staying out of trouble this year. We laughed over that and swiveled a few degrees to watch his progress down the street. It was about that time that things seemed, to me, to suddenly slow down, as though we were watching film on a screen and the projectionist had pulled some lever marked slow motion or low gear or whatever. Later, remembering with John, he said it was nearly the same for him, vaguely unreal, not at all a comfortable feeling. We saw Barclay moving casually along. Then moments later, saw the front door of Bud McKinnon's house swing open, saw little Sarah McKinnon dart out. I remember thinking it was strange Sarah would not be in school. She was at least 8 years old, and then realized it was Friday, the end of the first grading period of the year. The grammar school was out until Monday. Sarah was clearly in a hurry, charging forth to meet some friend or to complete some errand for her mother, for she madly scrambled along the sidewalk, a large grin on her face, something clutched in one chubby fist. It did not take her long to catch up with Barclay. That was when it happened. As she attempted to pass Barclay on his right, the visitor quickly and agilely, without so much as glancing over his shoulder, sidestepped in that direction. Sarah McKinnon skidded on the still damp pavement and almost fell, but like most children, she was blessed with a natural grace and regained her balance. She did not seem deterred at all and simply swung to the left. Barclay, still walking, still not looking back, moved right with her, blocking her path. "What the hell's he think he's doing?" John said. And it seemed as though his voice came from a great distance. I did not answer. I had no answer. But I felt a very palpable sense of impending trouble gathering in my chest. I had no idea what the trouble would be, but I knew, as surely as I knew the date and the name of my town, as surely as I knew my name, that it was coming. I had never experienced anything quite like it before, and I clutched the windowsill as though it were a life ring and watched. Out on the sidewalk, I saw Sarah half running, half walking now, swing right, then left, then right again. Each time, wispy little Kent Barclay moved with her, moved ahead of her, blocking her route. They had reached the corner of Wislow and Main, crossed into the next block. Barclay continued to amble on, as though unaware of the child behind him trying to pass. Yet he couldn't truly be unaware, could he? No, of course not. he was playing a game with the girl. They were old friends from the park or the playground behind the municipal building, and this was just a game they played when they happened to meet. A tradition, a ritual. But I did not believe it. That sense of trouble had mounted, like a squeezing hand around my heart, and I could only watch and wonder what in the name of God that crazy little tourist thought he was doing. Then outside, Sarah McKinnon, surely irritated now, made her move. I have no doubt she saw only two options. One, veer wide to the right across the front lawns of the houses, and two, veer left into the street. Yes, even to this day, I'm quite certain the most sensible courses of action, taking another route or slowing and stopping, waiting for Barclay to disappear in the distance, never even entered her eager 8-year-old mind. And so she did what any impatient youngster would do. She chose from the two options she saw, and she chose what she doubtless thought was the simplest, which in this case, since she was already to the far left of the sidewalk, meant darting out into the street. I heard the car before I saw it, heard its dreadfully squealing tires as the driver floored the brakes, heard the protesting wail of its horn. Then I saw it flash into view, saw it strike the running girl, and then I heard the final sound. The final sound, that is, until the shouting began moments later. I heard the dull and thickening sound of the girl being hit. "Jesus!" John Barlow said. "Jesus!" Barclay simply kept on strolling, not glancing back, as though nothing at all had happened. I remember the next hours only dimly, as though I viewed them through a sheet of gauze or through a thick fog bank that distorted thought as well as vision. I remember John and I running to the scene. I remember the shocked white face of the driver, his protest that he hadn't seen her, that she had just run in front of him, just like that, my God, just right out in front. I remember the volunteer ambulance pulling up. I remember Dr. McCauley coming and pronouncing her dead. I remember her sobbing mother, 3-year-old brother. Most of all, I remember the sudden new loathing I felt for Kent Barclay. I remember all that, but as I just stated, I remember it only vaguely, as though from a dream. The early minutes of our gathering in the True Value the next morning were bleak and silent. Then things turned quickly and bitterly angry. John and I were the only ones who had witnessed the accident, the only ones who had seen the bizarre little duel on the sidewalk prior. The others were perfectly willing to believe us, however, as though they had been quietly waiting all these years for something tangible to pin on our annual visitor. Still, we all knew there was nothing legally to be done. There is no actual law against lurching back and forth on the sidewalk, impeding the progress of an impatient 8-year-old girl. And he hadn't forced her to run into the street. Even if he had, there was no way we could prove it. Certainly no way we could prove he had known the car was coming. But if our legal channels were nil, there seemed to be a harsh consensus around the card table that morning that our moral course was open and extremely clear-cut. "We got to kick the bastard out," Paul Kendricks said. "I don't know what his game is, but we don't need him in the Falls." Joey Wenderson coughed and nodded. "Should have done it long ago." A brief silence ensued, and then Frank Bishop said, "Think we can keep him from coming back next year?" Kendricks laughed jaggedly. "Damn right we can. Our town, ain't it? We'll just tell him he ain't welcome. Tell him if he shines his pussy-looking face round here next fall, we'll kick him right out. Kick him out, hell! We'll kill the bastard." The law, I said weakly. Fuck the law, Joey Wenderson said. We got a duty. He can count himself lucky we ain't gonna walk over there and kill him right now. I nodded. Despite my newfound hate for Barkley, I had no doubt he could consider himself very lucky indeed. There was some short discussion of who would get the honor of speaking to Barkley. Harv Benedict was suggested and rejected. We all knew the police chief had a difficult enough time mustering the courage to hand out a speeding ticket. He could not be entrusted with such a delicate matter as this, even assuming he could be convinced that Barkley had to go. Then Frank Bishop looked at me and said, "How about you, Matthew?" My eyes widened. But before I could protest, there was round after round of agreement from the others. I was well-spoken and diplomatic, yet just tough enough for my years in the North to make my words stick. It was that old specter of superior education and experience come to haunt me at last. Besides that, it was pointed out, I believed as deeply as any of them that Barkley was dangerous, and I had been there when Sarah McKinnon was killed. That gave me additional ammunition. After one or two flimsy arguments, I agreed. I had no doubt in my mind that Barkley should go, that Patterson Falls would be infinitely better off without him. I did doubt, however, our position if the little man should decide to press his legal right to vacation or sightsee where he wished. Still, what choice did I have? In my new, angered state of mind, it seemed to have come down to an us or him proposition. The next day, Sunday, it rained again, and as I approached Elvira Martin's boarding house, I looked up and saw him standing in the window of room number 3, simply looking out, and I felt my loathing wash back over me like a wave of hot water. The first moments of our meeting in the dingy but astringently neat little room were harmless enough. He remembered me from occasional encounters in previous years and even remembered to inquire if I missed teaching. However, when I came to the subject at hand, the tension seemed to mount almost immediately. "Leave?" Barkley repeated, his bland little face clouding. "Leave town?" I nodded. "As soon as possible." "I'm afraid I don't understand." I took a deep breath and attempted to explain to him our position, explain how the mounting accidents over the years had changed our good opinion of him, how it would be better for all involved if he were just to slip away and forget about the falls. I withheld mention of Sarah McKinnon and what John Barlow and I had seen, thinking, rather obscurely, that I might need that as leverage later. Barkley heard me out politely enough, but his expression grew darker by the moment. When I was finished, he leaned toward me so quickly that I thought for one absurd moment he was going to strike. But instead, he merely coughed and then leaned back, frowning. "You have no legal right," he said. "I realize that, Mr. Barkley. We all realize that, but you've got the town set on edge. Some are talking about violence. Now, don't you think it would be better for everyone if you Violence? Violence? Because of a few harmless accidents? You have no right. You have no grounds. Mr. Barkley, there's no sense in arguing about it. The town's made up its mind, and you're not likely to change it. Now, you're going to leave today, and you're not going to come back next year. If you feel such an urgent need to sightsee in this area, why don't you try Ishpeming or Michigami or Champion? Why don't you go north to the Copper Country? All very lovely, I can assure you. Just don't come back to Patterson Falls." For a moment, he said nothing. He merely stared at me. I thought my cool enforcer posture had been successful. Then he smiled, a sweet, dripping, horribly sickening smile, and said, "I'm afraid that would be impossible, Mr. Jacobs, and you'd better go back and tell your friends I said so." "There's no such thing as impossible, Barkley." "Oh, indeed there is. I have work to do here. I must come back." I almost laughed. "Work? What work? Walking around the streets, looking at the sky? Herding children on bikes, making old men put their hands through glass doors, knocking axes off the wall in the hardware store?" I felt my reserve crumbling, my anger come boiling through, but anger mixed with an odd glee, as though I had been waiting for this moment a long time. "What work?" I grinned maniacally. "Forcing little girls into the street so they get struck by cars?" I expected some expression of surprise at that statement, but I was disappointed. He only maintained that nauseating smile. And there was something else, something above the smile. It was in his eyes, a dark look of gleaming hatred. Or perhaps it wasn't hatred. Perhaps it was, I don't know. But it was there, and it drove an ice shard of fear into my heart. I felt the pain of it and drew back as he spoke his next words. "I think that's all, Mr. Jacobs. Be sure to tell everyone what I said. Good day now." I opened my mouth to speak, but could find no words. The pain in my chest was now above the tight constriction of simple unease. It was shattering. I rose, backed away, and fumbled my way out the door. I was halfway down the stairs when I lost consciousness. I stayed in the hospital nearly 2 months. The doctor said I was extremely fortunate. It was a massive heart attack, he said, the kind that frequently refuses to give folks my age a second chance. I'm back in town now, though spending my time much the way I spent it before, only at a much slower pace. There were some days in July and August when I had to forego the Saturday sessions at the True Value, when it was just too hot, too stunningly humid to consider the long walk downtown, the strain of the discussions. But I don't have to worry about that anymore. It's September, you see, and the weather has turned blessedly cool and most pleasant. He's coming back. I admit, there were times throughout the bleak winter months when I tried to delude myself into thinking Barkley was bluffing. After all, he was just a little wisp of a man. I must have intimidated him somewhat. Even in spring and summer I clung to that hope, foolish as it was. Barkley was bluffing. The attack was just ugly coincidence. But it's autumn now, the time of beauty, the dying time of leaves and grass and foolish dreams. He's coming back. He has work to do here. There is nothing I can do, nothing any of us can do to alter that. In some comic, horrible way, he's like an absurd little postman refusing to be stayed from his duties. Work to do. I wonder why. And oh God, I wonder what it's going to be this year.